One of the great mysteries of the desert is, of course, the story that goes under many different names and comes in many different versions. Perhaps the most famous name for it is the Atlantis of the sands, of course referring to the sunken city of Atlantis, but here referring to another city that's supposed to have disappeared into the sands of Arabia. Now, there are different versions of this story. You might have encountered it in different forms of popular culture. The most obvious example I can come up with right now is that it is central to the plot of the 2011 video game Uncharted 3, subtitle I am forgetting. But anyway, it's this story that there was once a great Arabian city out here in the desert, but that because of God's wrath, it disappeared. So the sands took it and it was lost to history. Now the story of this city, or the different versions of it, is a bit more complicated than you might think. There is a story similar to this in the Qur'an, as well as in many of the old tales from the Middle East and Arabia, like in the Arabian Nights or the 1001 Nights. In the Qur'an, it speaks of a city called Iram. Iram that al-Imad, so Iram of the lofty pillars. And this is a city that was inhabited by a people called Ad, the people of Ad. And what the story is that these people were sinning, they were unjust, and a prophet was sent to them, the prophet Hud in the Qur'an, who tried to make them improve their situation, but they didn't. They didn't listen to the words of the prophet and of God, and so God punished them by making the city disappear into the sands here of the desert of Arabia. And there are similar stories in the 1001 Nights, for example. So that's directly from the Qur'an. Now, that story existed across history, but then something happens, and this is mainly in the 20th century. There were British explorers here in Oman, for example, in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, in places like the Rub al-Khali, the Great Sand Desert, who said that there were also folk tales here of a city called Ubar that also is supposed to have disappeared. So there's the city called Ubar, and that was an important trade center or something, but then the story or the city disappeared. And so what many have done, especially in modern times, is to connect the story of Ubar with the story of Iram in the Qur'an and say that this is the same city, this Atlantis of the sands that's out there somewhere in the Arabian desert, which of course is a very romantic story, and many people have tried to find it. There is even one place where it is claimed that Ubar has been found right here in Oman. But what's the actual story here? What is this lost city? Is there any truth to it? And how has this story of this city developed and changed over time? Today I wanted to spend some time and go through and explore the true story about the Atlantis of the sands. The most famous mention of the lost city of Iram and the people of Ad comes from the Qur'an itself. Here, it warns people of the fate of this people who were destroyed by God's wrath. It says, أَلَمْ تَرَى كَيْفَ فَعَلَ رَبُّكَ بِعَادٍ إِرَامَ ذَاتِ الْعِمَادِ الَّتِي لَمْ يُخْلَقْ مِثْلُهَا فِي الْبِلَادِ. Have you, Prophet, considered how your Lord dealt with the people of Ad, of Iram, the city of lofty pillars, whose like has never been made in any land? Now, this is Abdul Halim's translation, and he adds some common assumptions in the brackets, but if we look just at the Arabic, it never actually clarifies that Iram is a city. It just literally says, have you not considered how your Lord dealt with Ad, Iram of the lofty pillars, or of lofty stature, and the ambiguity here might actually be kind of important. In any case, while Iram is never mentioned again in the Qur'an, the people of Ad are. Indeed, they come up in several places, often alongside the people of Thamud, as Arabic tribes or people who were sent prophets but denied God's message and were destroyed for it. In the case of Ad, the prophet among their people is known as Hud. Hud and Saleh, who is the one sent to Thamud, are two of the Arabic prophets in the Qur'an that are unique to this scripture, as they aren't mentioned at all in the biblical narratives. We don't get much more than this about the story of Ad in the Qur'an. The places they are mentioned pretty much tell the same general story without much detail. Hud was sent to them as a prophet. It is said that they lived among the Ahqaf, which means the sand dunes, indicating that they were indeed in Arabia somewhere, and they rejected the message sent through Hud by God and were therefore destroyed. Hence, they are used in the Qur'an as mostly a warning against people not to go down the same path. So to find out more about who or what or when they were, and what this mysterious Iram of the lofty pillars is, we have to look at other sources. Luckily, Iram and the people of Ad are already mentioned in pre-Islamic poetry. Based on this, we can conclude that this was a legendary story that was known to the Arabs at the time. The people of Ad seem to have been a great people of high stature, but that they had disappeared somehow. For example, the poet Labid, who was a contemporary with the Prophet, wrote, quote, "Iram and Ad tasted his punishment, and Thamud did so later." And even earlier, Suraym ibn Ma'ashar al-Taghlibi from the 6th century sang, quote, "If I had been of the race of Ad and of Iram, brought up among them, and of Luqman and Dhul-Jadan." What these poems seem to indicate is not only that the story of Ad and Iram was famous in pre-Islamic times, but it also seems that these poets are referring to Iram not as a place, but as a people. Now there is still some ambiguity and they could be read both ways, but the way it is phrased definitely points to Iram being a group of people. Similarly, in some of the early Qur'an tafsirs, or Qur'an commentaries like in At-Tabari, different interpretations are brought up, both Iram as a designation of a place, but also as a people, perhaps as an alternative designation for Ad, or maybe as a tribe within the larger people of Ad, so to say. Indeed, At-Tabari himself seems to prefer the latter interpretation rather than Iram as a place or a city. Quote, "Among them," that is Tabari's interpretations, is the view that Iram can be interpreted as a place name, with possible identifications as Alexandria or Damascus, or rather Ash-Shihr in Hadramaut. Yet as a word, Iram could mean people or nation, ummah, could mean old, al-qadima, or perishing. Furthermore, Iram could denote a tribe, a qabila, of the Ad people, which could derive from Iram as the name of an ancestor of the Ad, a descendant of Noah. Now, the question of these lofty pillars, Dhat al-Imad, is also interesting. The common interpretation, if we base ourselves on the idea that Iram is a city, is that it was a city with high pillars or buildings. In a more modest way, it could refer to high tent poles, perhaps, of the tents that this people lived in, indicating that they were nomadic peoples. Or, if Iram was more a place or a region rather than a city per se, it could also, of course, refer to some feature of the natural landscape, perhaps high mountains or rock formations. If we go by the idea that Iram is a people rather than a place, perhaps the same people as Ad, then the verse can also be read as simply meaning of lofty stature, referring to the high status and opulence of the people themselves. But in any case, the legendary story of Iram as a great city of riches soon started becoming popular in literature, not least through stories that were later included in the 1001 Nights, or the Arabian Nights. The scholar Peter Webb traces these legends and stories particularly to southern Arabia during Umayyad and Abbasid times, where writers talk about Iram as the city of the Ad people and particularly locates it in southern Arabia, either in the Hadramaut region or outside of Aden. As we saw, the Qur'an itself doesn't really say anything other than the fact that the people of Ad lived among the Ahqaf, or the sand dunes, but it doesn't really specify any location. But many writers from Yemen and southern Arabia at this time seem to see themselves as the descendants of the Ad in some way, and to locate its settlement in their region. Furthermore, writers like Al-Hamadani, Al-Mas'udi, and others describe Iram as a great, splendid, and rich city with many great columns or pillars, a legendary imperial city that was built by a figure called Shaddad ibn Ad. The legend said that this once great city had been destroyed by God, as mentioned in the Qur'an, and disappeared into the desert sands. The mystique and legend of the city had really started to spread at this time, and Al-Hamadani, for example, wrote of the city's many treasures and riches that supposedly existed within its ruins. But, of course, no one could access them because they were buried, or at least invisible to human beings. But he also tells of a story where the old city did appear once in all its original glory to one Bedouin man. And it is this story that appears in the 1001 Nights as the story of the city of the many-columned Iram. The story tells of a Bedouin man, Abdullah ibn Abi Qilaba, who loses his she-camel in the deserts near Yemen in southern Arabia. But as he was searching for the camel, he suddenly discovers a massive abandoned city. It might actually be worth just quoting directly from one version of the story here. Quote, "He came upon a great city girt by a vast castle around which were palaces and pavilions that rose high into middle air. He made for the place, thinking to find there folk of whom he might ask concerning his she-camel. But when he reached it, he found it desolate, without a living soul in it. So he said, I alighted, and hobbling my dromedary and composing my mind, entered into the city. Now when I came to the castle, I found it had 2 vast gates. Never in the world was seen their like for size and height, inlaid with all manner jewels and jacinths, white and red, yellow and green. Beholding this, I marveled with great marvel, and thought the case mighty wondrous. Then, entering the citadel in a flutter of fear and dazed with surprise and affright, I found it long and wide, about equaling Al-Medina in point of size. And therein were lofty palaces laid out in pavilions and built of gold and silver and inlaid with many-colored jewels and jacinths and chrysolites and pearls. And the door-leaves in the pavilions were like those of the castle for beauty, and their floors were strewn with great pearls and balls, no smaller than hazelnuts, of musk and ambergris and saffron. Now when I came within the heart of the city, and saw therein no created being of the sons of Adam, I was near swooning and dying for fear. Moreover, I looked down from the great roofs of the pavilion chambers and their balconies, and saw rivers running under them, and in the main streets were fruit-laden trees and tall palms, and the manner of their building was one brick of gold and one of silver. So I said to myself, doubtless this is the paradise promised for the world to come. Then I loaded with me the jewels of its gravel and the musk of its dusk, as much as I could carry, and returned to my own country, where I told the folk of what I had seen." End quote. As he returns home, he goes to the Caliph Muawiyah and tells him of his adventures. When the Caliph then calls on a man called Ka'b al-Ahbar to get his opinion of the story, the latter tells them the story of the legendary city of Iram, built by the ancient king Shaddad ibn Ad, or of the tribe of Ad, who built the great city to be the most marvelous in the world, even being inspired by paradise itself. But God, as we know from the stories, was not happy with him and destroyed the city, returning it to the sands. Ka'b also says that only one person's sins has found the city, one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, and that this man, Abdullah, is now the second. With all these stories and legends, the myth of Iram as an archetypal paradisial city became a mainstay in Arabic and Islamic literature. Even in Qur'an commentaries, the reading of the verse of Iram as a place and a city became a lot more common, which is not to say that it is the incorrect reading to begin with, of course. The story of the lost city in the sands no longer served just as a warning from God, but also as a place that one longed to, a place that represented magnificent riches and beauty and the grandeur of an ancient great civilization. Over the centuries, the story would be expanded upon even more. Its inhabitants were giants who lived right after the time of the prophet Noah. The city was invisible to human eyes, but could be found somewhere out there in the sands, influenced probably by the story of the Bedouin man Abdullah. Particularly popular is the theory that the city is buried somewhere in the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter in southern Arabia. These fantastical tales that emerged are indicated by Ibn Khaldun, the great historian and writer of the 14th and 15th century, who writes critically about them in his Al-Muqaddimah. He says, "Others go so far in their crazy talk as to maintain that the city lies hidden from sensual perception and can be discovered only by trained magicians and sorcerers. All these are assumptions that would better be termed nonsense." But these legendary stories, in all their variation, have persisted until this very day. Even in popular culture outside of the Arabic-speaking world, the legend of the hidden city shows up in places like the video game Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception, where it makes up a core part of the story. But there's another aspect to this story, another name often used for this lost city, at least in contemporary context, which is Ubar. But where does this name come from, and what is its actual relationship to the city of Iram? Well, this is actually one of the most obscure parts of this whole story, and the pre-modern history of Ubar, or Wabar as it is known in Arabic, is kind of murky. Ubar, or Wabar, is indeed a place that is mentioned in medieval sources as a lost city in the sands of Arabia, so very similar, but nowhere are the two actually equated in that way, at least not yet. Yaqut al-Hamawi is one of our best medieval sources. He writes in a work called Mu'jam al-Buldan that, quote, "Wabar bil-fatha wa akhruhu ra' أرض كانت من منازل عد بين الشهر ونجران وحضرموت وقيل بين اليمن والرمل قالوا هلكت عد وبقيت أرضهم لا يسكنها أحد ويقال إن الجن تسكنه." Wabar, or Ubar, with fatha and ending with ra, so just commenting on the spelling of the word and the pronunciation of the word. And then he says, a land that was among the dwelling places of the Ad, located between Shihr, Najran, and Hadramaut. And, they say, between Yemen and Al-Ramal, or the desert, or the sands. It was said the Ad perished and not a single thing remained living in their land. It is also said that it is a place where jinn live. This is interesting. As you can see, there's a kind of connection with Iram in the sense that Wabar, or Ubar, is also said to be the home of the Ad people, and that it was destroyed, only ruins being left, which are now inhabited by the mysterious jinn. And other works around the same time basically say the same thing. They talk about Wabar not as a city, but more as a region in southern Arabia, one that is sometimes associated with the Ad and often with ruins, old disappeared civilizations, and jinn. So there is some connection with Iram in the general outlines, but again, they never equate them or talked about them as the same thing. That would have to wait until the 20th century and Western Orientalists and explorers in the Middle East who were fascinated by the stories of lost cities in the desert. One of the most important of these for our story is the English explorer and diplomat Bertram Thomas. He is known as the first documented Westerner to cross the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, which is the great sand dune desert in Arabia where many of the legends about the lost city pinpoint its location. In works like Arabia Felix and various articles, he describes Wabar as a place in southern Arabia, but also recounts stories he had heard about Wabar as a golden city lying beneath the sands. He says in his travel account through the desert, quote, "Suddenly the Arabs, who were always childishly anxious to draw attention to anything they thought would interest me, pointed to the ground. 'Look, Sahib,' they cried, 'there is the road to Ubar.' Ubar, I wondered. It was a great city, our fathers have told us, that existed of old, a city rich in treasure, with date gardens and a fort of red silver. It now lies buried beneath the sands in the Ramlat some few days to the north. Other Arabs on my previous journeys had told me of Ubar, the Atlantis of the sands, but none could say where it lay. If this account is to be believed, then it seems that there were stories circulating among the Arabs about Ubar or Wabar as a lost golden city hidden beneath the sands. It is also here that Thomas coins the term Atlantis of the sands for the city, which has become so famous and popular. T.I. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, is often attributed with this invention, which is thus not accurate, but he was also one of the people that were deeply fascinated by this myth and wanted to go search for it in the empty quarter. But it is also with these Western explorers and writers, in their fascination with these stories, that we see the first conflation of Iram and Ubar. The stories are similar enough, I guess, and thus Orientalists began arguing that both Iram and Wabar refer to the same place, a place that they were very eager to try and find. As we have seen from the traditional accounts, this conflation of the two is not something that we find in any of the classical sources, even assuming that Iram was originally meant as a city. So now, in modern times, we often talk about Iram, Ubar, Atlantis of the sands as one and the same thing, as can be seen in Uncharted 3, for example. And in the last couple of decades, there are some archaeologists that actually have claimed to have found Wabar in southern Oman. It was the filmmaker and amateur archaeologist Nicholas Clapp who, in the 1990s, organized an expedition to find the Atlantis of the sands. It is largely Clapp who is responsible for identifying Ubar with the story of Iram in the Qur'an, an idea that has stuck in public imagination since then. Along with British explorers Sir Ranulph Fiennes and others, they actually claim to have found the ruins of Wabar in a place called Shisr in the Dhofar region of southern Oman. The ruins of an old settlement is indeed there, and it contains some high towers, which has been used, of course, to argue for its identification with the so-called lofty pillars. This was all documented in a book called The Road to Ubar, Finding the Atlantis of the Sands, and it's become a popular site attracting tourists and enthusiasts since then. This discovery and its identification with Ubar, and especially with Iram, is obviously not accepted by everyone, and it's very contentious. In terms of Wabar, which does appear in medieval sources as a region of southern Arabia where there may be ruins, it is of course possible that this settlement was part of that wider region and category, but as I hope I've shown in this episode so far, equating it with Iram comes with a lot of problems and difficulties. In short, based on the evidence we have presented, we simply don't really know for sure. Is this place the lost city of Wabar? Was there such a city? Is Ubar the same as Iram? Was Iram even meant as a place in the original sources, or is it rather a designation for a tribe or a people related to the Ad? A lot of questions and very few sure answers. But hold up. The story actually isn't done yet. In fact, only in the last few years, there are some significant archaeological discoveries that have been made that could turn this whole thing upside down. And quite literally too. Because these discoveries are in a completely different place from where we've been looking this whole time, in northern Arabia, in what is today Jordan. There's a region here known as Wadi Rum, a beautiful valley in a desert area. And here, scholars have found several inscriptions that shed light on the legend of the Ad and Iram. These discoveries are presented by Dr. Ahmad Al-Jallad in an article entitled The Epigraphy of the Tribe of Ad. For example, excavations of a Nabatean temple at the base of Jebel Ram in this region, from around the 1st century AD, give us a curious inscription which mentions the goddess who is at Iram. And another one from the same region says, quote, Allatu, the great goddess who is at Iram. Indeed, the old inscriptions and material evidence suggests that the Wadi Ram, the valley of Ram, used to be referred to as Iram. In other words, the answer might have been hiding right in front of our noses the entire time. Wadi Ram is Wadi Iram. The first letter had simply fallen away with time. But even if this indicates that they had the same name, does this necessarily mean that it is the Iram of the Ad that's mentioned in the Qur'an? Well, this is where the story gets really interesting and where some more recent discoveries have really changed our outlook. Indeed, in the late 90s, new excavations of the temple of Alat at Wadi Ram, or Iram, revealed a new text, which says, "By Ghawth, son of Aus Allah, son of Takam, and he built the temple of Alat of the tribe of Ad." And another inscription from the same region reads, "By Zahi, son of Amr, of the lineage of Ad." This is amazing. It relates the place called Iram with the tribe of Ad, thus indicating that this is indeed the legendary place and people mentioned in the Qur'an. But it also means that much of the traditional narrative has been turned on its head. It wasn't a people living in southern Arabia, but rather in the north, in what is today southern Jordan, although that of course doesn't mean that they only existed there. And it also forces us to rethink the timeline. No longer are the Ad a legendary people that lived thousands of years ago shortly after the story of Noah and the Ark, but they were instead active around 2,000 years ago, around the turn of the Common Era. In terms of the Qur'an's reference to the Ahqaf, or the sand dunes, this also fits rather well with the environment around Wadi Ram. And even if they lived more recently than what has been commonly believed, it certainly seems to be true that they at some point disappeared from history. In other words, the Ad seem to be real. They are certainly no giants, and they lived around 2,000 years ago in northern Arabia. And possibly this region around Wadi Ram, or Wadi Iram, might actually be the place that was called Iram and where these people lived. In other words, the story is by no means over, and there are probably a lot of very interesting things left to discover in the deserts and rocky terrain of Arabia. So as you can tell, the story is a bit more complicated than it's often told. There is a truth to the fact that this story exists in the Qur'an. There is this city in southern Oman that's claimed to be the city of Ubar, but the connecting of these two old tales with each other seems to be a modern development. And whether or not the city of Ubar is really the city in the Qur'an, it's quite unlikely, as well as all the different theories about the people of Ad. To be frank, it's not as romantic maybe as we are often led to believe. That doesn't mean that it isn't a very interesting and very mysterious story, and there are still aspects of it that I think are still really fascinating. And there is this incredible air of mystery to the whole thing, especially when you're out here in this desert and you can sort of maybe imagine that these sands here, these dunes, hide many secrets, maybe including a once great ancient city. Who knows?